There's a very short list of movies that can make a grown man cry, a teenager quote dialogue at a party, and a 6-year-old ask for it on repeat, all at the same time. The Princess Bride sits right at the top of that list. Rob Reiner's 1987 fairy tale gave us a farm boy who becomes a pirate, a Sicilian who thinks he's smarter than everyone in the room, a giant with a rhyming habit, a swordsman on a decades-long revenge mission, and a six-fingered villain who really should not have underestimated any of them. But the story behind the story is just as strange as anything that happens in Florin. Before we get into it, if you're a fan of deep dives into the classics you grew up with, stick around and consider subscribing. It genuinely helps. Now, let's climb the cliffs of insanity and count down 15 weird facts about The Princess Bride. Long before the movie existed, William Goldman had already spent 300 pages messing with his readers, and most of them never even noticed. The novel isn't presented as a simple fairy tale. It's framed as an abridgment, Goldman's trimmed-down version of a much longer, supposedly classic work by a Florinese author named S. Morgenstern. According to Goldman's introduction, his father read him this good parts version as a boy, and years later, as an adult, Goldman went looking for the full text so he could share it with his own son, only to discover it was bloated with tedious historical detours that needed cutting. None of it was true. There was no S. Morgenstern, no lost original, and as it turns out, no son either. Goldman invented the entire apparatus purely to add a layer of mischief to his fairy tale, and he committed to the bit for decades. Later editions of the book include increasingly absurd updates about fictional legal disputes with the Morgenstern estate, and Goldman even dangles a tantalizing, never-delivered sequel called Buttercup's Baby, complete with fake behind-the-scenes drama explaining why readers will never get to see it. It's a wildly layered joke wrapped around a sincere, old-fashioned love story, and it's part of why the book still reads like nothing else on the shelf. Before we count down, it's worth remembering just how unlikely this movie's existence really is. Nearly every person attached to it, the author, the director, half the cast, had some reason to believe it might never actually get made, or that if it did, nobody would show up to watch it. That it became one of the most rewatched comfort films of the last 4 decades anyway is arguably a fact all on its own. Believe it or not, one of the most quoted comedies of the 1980s, spent roughly 12 years bouncing around Hollywood as a supposed lost cause. 20th Century Fox originally bought the rights back in the early 1970s, with plans for director Richard Lester to bring it to the screen. That deal collapsed. Over the following years, names like Francois Truffaut, Norman Jewison, and Robert Redford were all connected to potential versions that never got off the ground. Studio executives simply couldn't agree on what kind of movie it was supposed to be: comedy, adventure, romance, satire. And in an industry that likes to sort projects into tidy boxes, that uncertainty was treated like a warning sign. At one point, the difficulty of packaging the story reportedly cost more than one studio executive their job, shortly after committing to it. Eventually, Goldman took matters into his own hands and bought the rights back, so the project wouldn't rot in a drawer somewhere. It wasn't until Rob Reiner, fresh off directing this as Spinal Tap, read the script and refused to sand down its stranger edges that the movie finally found its footing. Reiner kept the odd little frame story of a grandfather reading to his sick grandson fully intact, even though it's exactly the kind of thing a more cautious studio might have cut for pacing. Along the way, other well-known directors had briefly circled the project too, including Francois Truffaut and Norman Jewison, but none of those versions made it past early talks. Rob Reiner has said the film's central challenge was never really about money or casting. It was about finding someone willing to trust that audiences could handle a story that refused to sit still in one genre. When Vizzini shrieks about the cliffs of insanity, that's not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. The production filmed those sequences at the real cliffs of Moher on Ireland's County Clare coastline, a formation that rises somewhere around 700 feet above the Atlantic. There was no green screen standing in for that drop. The crew brought cameras out to an honest-to-goodness sheer cliff face and shot Wesley's climb with the actual ocean crashing far below. The clifftop duel between Wesley and Inigo, notably, was shot back at Shepperton Studios in England for safety reasons, since staging a full sword fight on the literal edge of a cliff famous for unpredictable, powerful coastal winds wasn't exactly worth the risk. But the climbing shots, the ones that sell the sheer scale of the place, are the genuine article. It's one of several moments in the film where Reiner opted for a real, slightly dangerous location instead of a safer studio backdrop, and it shows in how much weight those shots still carry decades later. The cliffs of Moher weren't the only real backdrop the production leaned on either. Much of the movie was shot across England, with locations in Derbyshire standing in for Buttercup's farm and the city of Florin, alongside additional filming in Buckinghamshire and Kent. Combined with the Irish coastline, the mix of genuine countryside and rugged cliffline gives the film a lived-in, tactile quality that's easy to take for granted next to today's more digitally constructed fantasy worlds. Early in the shoot, Cary Elwes made the mistake of accepting a dare. André the Giant, who got around set on an all-terrain vehicle because he was simply too large for most vehicles, had spent the day needling Elwes about not being worthy of riding it. Elwes, naturally, decided to prove him wrong. Riding uphill, unfamiliar with the machine, his foot caught between the gear pedal and a rock as he shifted, and his big toe snapped backward and broke clean. Terrified that an injury this early in production might get him replaced, Elwes tried to hide it, which obviously didn't work for very long. When Rob Reiner found out, he wasn't interested in recasting his lead. He simply reassured Elwes that nobody else could play Wesley. But the production did have to shuffle the schedule, pushing the elaborate, physically demanding sword duel with Mandy Patinkin toward the end of the shoot so Elwes had more time to heal. Even then, he trained and performed much of that legendary fight while still not fully recovered, favoring the foot in ways that quietly shaped his movement throughout the film. It also wasn't an isolated incident. Elwes has described the shoot as unusually accident-prone for him personally, with the broken toe turning out to be only the first of a couple of on-set mishaps he'd walk away from before filming wrapped. By the time filming began, Andre's body had already absorbed years of professional wrestling on top of the effects of acromegaly, the growth hormone condition that shaped his enormous size and came with relentless chronic pain. Standard doses of painkillers barely registered for someone his size. So, according to Cary Elwes, alcohol effectively became Andre's method of managing the pain doctors couldn't otherwise touch. His drink of choice, which the cast nicknamed the American, was a homemade concoction of around 40 ounces of mixed liquor, and he treated it the way most people treat a glass of water. By the end of the London shoot, Elwes has said the production accountant reported Andre's hotel bar tab had climbed past $40,000, a number that's been echoed across multiple interviews with his former co-stars. What makes the story land differently than a typical celebrity excess anecdote is the context Elwes has consistently given it. This wasn't recreational overindulgence so much as a giant of a man trying to get through each day's shoot in a body that was, by then, in near constant revolt against him. It's a detail that reframes a lot of the wilder André the Giant drinking lore that's floated around for years, from wrestling territories to late-night talk shows. Cast and crew members who worked with him on The Princess Bride have generally told a gentler version of the story than the tabloid legend suggests. Less party trick, more quiet, exhausting daily routine that let him keep showing up to play one of the gentlest characters in the whole film. The duel between Wesley and Inigo Montoya on the clifftop is often cited as one of the great sword fights in film history, and part of the reason is that there's no trick to it. Cary Elwes and Mandy Patinkin did every bit of that fencing themselves, with no stunt doubles standing in for the swordplay. To pull that off, both actors trained under Bob Anderson and Peter Diamond, the same fencing masters responsible for choreographing the lightsaber duels in the original Star Wars trilogy. According to Elwes, the two of them rehearsed for roughly 3 weeks before filming even began, then continued training during production, sometimes squeezing in 5-minute sessions between takes. At points during the tightest stretch of shooting, Patinkin has described practicing 8 to 10 hours a day. Both actors also had to learn defense with either hand, which sets up the film's famous reveal that neither man had actually been fighting at his full ability the whole time. It's a joke that only works because two actors quietly put in months of real, physically demanding preparation to make an already impressive fight look effortless. The technical vocabulary the two characters toss around mid-fight, terms describing specific parries and thrusts, wasn't invented for the movie either. Those come from genuine historical fencing terminology, the kind of detail that suggests Goldman did real homework on swordplay before ever putting pen to paper on the scene. Combined with Anderson and Diamond's choreography, it's part of why the sequence has aged so much better than most movie sword fights from the same era, which often relied more on quick cuts and stunt doubles than on two lead actors who could actually fence. Vizzini's constant, jittery insistence that everything is going according to plan may have come a little too naturally to Wallace Shawn. Before filming started, Shawn learned through his own agent that Danny DeVito had been the studio's original choice for the role. Rather than shaking it off, Shawn reportedly spent much of the production genuinely convinced he was about to be replaced, second-guessing his performance and picturing how DeVito might have played each scene differently. Cast members have said the anxiety was visible on set, including during the tense Battle of Wits poison scene, where Shawn can be seen visibly sweating. Whatever the personal cost to Shawn, the nervous, slightly manic energy fits Vizzini like a glove, a supposed criminal mastermind who insists he's always one step ahead, delivered by an actor who spent the whole shoot afraid he might not even make it to the next scene. André the Giant, by multiple accounts, tried to put Shawn at ease during some of the more physically demanding moments on the cliffs, gently reassuring his much smaller castmate rather than treating the anxiety as an inconvenience. It's a small, kind detail that fits with how consistently former co-stars have described André off-camera. In the scene where Count Ruggin strikes Wesley unconscious, the production didn't fake the impact quite as carefully as you'd expect. Elwes has explained that he suggested Christopher Guest actually tap him with the sword hilt to help sell the moment, rather than relying purely on camera tricks. Guest, not a trained stunt performer, swung harder than intended and connected solidly enough to genuinely knock Elwes out. The crew reportedly went quiet for several long seconds before Elwes came to. Reiner ultimately kept the footage, because it's difficult to manufacture a more convincing loss of consciousness than the real thing. It also wasn't Elwes's only injury of the shoot. Between the broken toe from the ATV incident and this knockout, he later joked that he developed something of a reputation on set for being accident-prone, even while the movie's swashbuckling hero was supposed to be the picture of grace under pressure. Guest, for his part, reportedly felt awful about what happened, even though nobody blamed him for the miscalculation. It's the kind of story that only gets funnier with distance. In the moment, according to those who were there, it was genuinely frightening. Billy Crystal only spent a handful of days on set as Miracle Max, and by most accounts, he used that time to nearly derail production entirely, in the best possible way. Rather than sticking closely to the script, Crystal spent roughly 3 days, working long hours each day, improvising an almost endless stream of new jokes and bits as the cranky, chocolate pill-peddling apothecary, rarely repeating a line twice. The problem was that everyone on set found him too funny to keep working. Elwes had to lie still as the supposedly mostly dead Wesley while Crystal riffed, just out of frame, and he broke character laughing often enough that the production reportedly swapped in a dummy for some shots. Rob Reiner, known for a big, easily triggered laugh, had to step away from set entirely at points because he couldn't stop himself from ruining takes. Mandy Patinkin managed to hold his composure on camera, but by his own account, the effort of suppressing his laughter for hours on end left him with an actual bruised rib, reportedly the only injury he sustained during the entire production. To make matters more chaotic, Elwes has said Crystal's improvisation didn't stop at the jokes that made the final cut. Plenty of the material was far too raunchy or off-color for a PG-rated fairy tale and had to be left on the cutting room floor, even if it kept the crew laughing between setups. The rodents of unusual size that ambushed Wesley in the fire swamp weren't puppets or early computer effects. They were stunt performers sewn into heavy, hot rat suits, and on at least one occasion, the production ran into a very human complication. According to Cary Elwes and Rob Reiner, the stunt performer scheduled to wrestle Wesley on camera simply didn't show up one morning. It turned out he'd been arrested overnight and was sitting in a jail cell. The crew ended up bailing him out so filming could continue, then got him zipped into the rat suit for the day's work. It's the kind of story that sounds almost too absurd to be true for a movie already full of oversized vermin and shrieking eels, but multiple people involved in the production have told versions of it over the years, which says something about just how eventful this particular shoot really was. Beyond the jailhouse detour, the rat suits themselves were reportedly miserable to work in. Heavy, poorly ventilated, and difficult to see out of, which meant the crew had to periodically pull performers out between takes just so nobody overheated under the hot studio lights. Of all the stories that have followed the Princess Bride around for decades, this one might be the most cheerfully ridiculous. According to Cary Elwes' own retelling, during a rehearsal early in the shoot, André the Giant let out what witnesses described as an extraordinarily long, extraordinarily loud burst of flatulence. One Elwes has said was timed at roughly 16 seconds and could apparently be heard well beyond the soundstage. The set reportedly went completely silent for a moment before everyone dissolved into laughter, ruining several takes in the process. Reiner, according to Elwes, eventually had to talk the cast back into focus by asking them to imagine how they'd feel if the rest of the room were laughing at them instead. It's obviously an anecdote that leans on colorful retelling rather than hard documentation. There's no footage of the moment itself, but it's one that Elwes, Reiner, and other members of the production have repeated consistently enough over the years that it's become as much a part of the film's folklore as anything that actually made it to the screen. What makes the anecdote stick, more than the shock value, is the punchline Elwes always attaches to it. Once the laughter died down and Reiner checked in on him, André reportedly just shrugged it off with a one-liner, entirely unbothered by having briefly stopped an entire film production in its tracks. For a movie this beloved, its theatrical release was almost shockingly quiet. The Princess Bride opened in the fall of 1987 on a $16 million budget and pulled in roughly $31 million domestically, landing around 41st place among that year's films at the box office, solidly behind bigger hits released around the same time. Critics liked it well enough, but audiences simply weren't showing up in numbers a modern classic would suggest. Then home video changed everything. Once the film hit VHS shelves, families started renting it, then buying it, then wearing out their copies through repeat viewings. Cary Elwes has said the movie didn't really have an audience on release and only found one in the home video market, where word of mouth did what the original marketing campaign couldn't. There was no reissue campaign or renewed theatrical push behind this second life, just people telling their friends to watch it, one worn-out tape at a time, until Inconceivable became a permanent fixture of pop culture. Reiner has pointed to marketing as a big part of the original problem, saying in later interviews that the film was genuinely difficult to categorize for audiences and that even the title itself worked against it, sounding to some moviegoers like a straightforward children's story rather than the sly, multi-genre adventure waiting inside. Once the home video release let people discover the film on their own terms, without a poster or trailer trying to sell them on a single genre, that mismatch stopped mattering. André's size made Fezzik's feats of strength look effortless on screen, but by the mid-1980s, decades of wrestling combined with the physical strain of his condition had done serious damage to his back. Lifting another person, the very thing Fezzik does constantly throughout the film, had become genuinely difficult and painful for him in real life. To get around this, the crew relied on hidden platforms, rigging, and careful camera angles so that actors could appear to be lifted or carried while actually supported by concealed equipment. It's a quiet bit of practical effects work that most viewers never notice, precisely because it was designed not to be noticed. By all accounts, André never complained about the toll the shoot took on him, and cast members have consistently described him as warm and easygoing on set, even while dealing with pain that the rest of the cast mostly didn't see. Interestingly, André wasn't the production's first idea for a towering strongman. Arnold Schwarzenegger, still relatively early in his film career at the time the project was first being packaged years earlier, had reportedly expressed interest in a similar role, though by the time filming actually began, his career had grown well beyond what the modestly budgeted production could afford. Before Wallace Shawn ever stepped foot on set, Danny DeVito had reportedly been the studio's first choice to play Vizzini. For reasons that remain a little murky, that casting never happened, and DeVito went on to other projects, including a movie with his eventual Princess Bride co-star Billy Crystal. Shawn stepped into the role instead, but the knowledge that he wasn't the original pick stuck with him the entire shoot. Watching the film now, It's genuinely hard to imagine anyone else delivering Vizzini's overconfident unraveling with quite the same nervous energy Sean brought to it. There's a strange bit of poetry in the fact that an actor playing a character who insists, again and again, that failure is impossible was privately convinced the whole time that he himself was about to fail. Sean wasn't the only cast member whose casting came down to a near miss elsewhere in Hollywood, either. By some accounts, other established actors were floated for Wesley before Cary Elwes landed the part, a reminder of just how differently this cast could have shaken out with only a handful of decisions going another way. Behind every layer of swordplay, revenge, and metafictional trickery, the whole thing started as a bedtime story. William Goldman has said that when his daughters asked him for a story about a princess and a story about a bride, he decided to combine the two ideas into one book, eventually publishing the novel in 1973 as a gift to them more than as a calculated literary project. Years later, he adapted his own novel into the screenplay, refusing for over a decade to let anyone water down the stranger, funnier, more sincere pieces of it just to make it easier to sell. That stubborn devotion to the original idea is arguably the reason the movie still works as well as it does. It never quite decided to be only a comedy, or only a romance, or only an adventure story, because it was never built that way in the first place. It was built as something a father wanted to share with his kids, and that sense of genuine affection is still baked into every frame of the finished film, more than 3 decades later. Even the film score carries a bit of that same personal, almost handmade quality. Composer Mark Knopfler, best known as the frontman of Dire Straits, took on the project and gave the film its distinctive, slightly wistful musical identity, a choice that added yet another genre-blurring layer to a movie that was already refusing to sit still in any single box. Rob Reiner, who passed away in December 2025, spent the rest of his career being asked about this film more than almost anything else he made, and by all accounts he never seemed to mind. For a project that so many people once considered a lost cause, that's about as happy an ending as Hollywood gets. And there you have it, 15 strange, surprising, and occasionally stomach-turning facts about one of the most quotable movies ever made. From a fake author hiding in plain sight on the book's cover to a real cliff, a real broken toe, and one genuinely unforgettable rehearsal interruption. It turns out the story behind The Princess Bride is nearly as memorable as the story on screen. If you enjoyed this trip through Florin and Gilder, let us know which fact surprised you most, and consider subscribing for more details.